The order was given between two others, neither of which Dominic Ralston, Duke of Carver, could later recall. He stood in the corridor outside the East Gallery with Crispin, his head footman, a list of minor commissions folded in one hand, and said it as he might have said any of them. "The portrait of the late Duchess in the gallery. Have it taken down this afternoon. Wrap it in Holland cloth and store it in the attic rooms. I shall be commissioning a new work for the space." Crispin, who had served the house for 11 years, did not blink. He noted it alongside a request to have the library shutters repaired and the silver candlesticks moved from the morning room to the dining room. The Duke moved on. The matter, to him, was settled before he reached the end of the corridor. Rowena heard it from the window seat of the small sitting room adjacent. The door had been left ajar, not by design, not by carelessness, simply because no one had thought to close it, which was itself a kind of carelessness. She had been reading, though the book had been open to the same page for the better part of an hour. She heard her husband's voice first, then Crispin's quiet acknowledgement, then the sound of boots continuing down the corridor. She turned the page she had not been reading, and turned the next one too, so that if anyone entered, they would see a woman deep in her book and think nothing of it. She had been married to Dominic for 4 months. She had been in this house for 3. The arithmetic did not quite align because there had been a month in London after the wedding, a month of introductions, of being presented to his acquaintances as the new Duchess of Carver with the particular care that society reserved for a second wife, which was to say that every compliment carried a footnote and every smile an audit. She had borne it with the composure that had recommended her to him in the first place, though he had not called it composure. He had called it suitability, which was the word a man used when he meant that a woman would not make demands he was unprepared to meet. Lady Elspeth Ralston, the first Duchess, had died 26 months before Rowena entered the house. She was present in the way that the dead are present in great houses, not as ghosts, but as architecture. Her taste was in the curtains she had chosen, the garden she had designed, the arrangement of furniture in the drawing room that no one had thought to alter, because no one could remember who had placed it, and so assumed it had always been thus. Her portrait in the East Gallery was a fine work, Elspeth seated beside a window with her daughter Nora on her lap, both of them caught in a wash of afternoon light that the painter had rendered with uncommon skill. Rowena had stood before it on her first morning in the house and thought that Elspeth looked like a woman who had known precisely where she belonged. Rowena was not jealous. She wished to be clear about this, though there was no one to be clear to. She had not married Dominic expecting to replace Elspeth in his affections. She had married him because her father, Mr. Geoffrey Wick, had died the previous autumn, leaving debts that made the family's position untenable, and because Dominic had offered for her hand through an intermediary with the straightforward efficiency of a man purchasing an adjacent parcel of land. She had accepted because the alternative was a slow and visible decline that would have consumed her mother and her younger sisters alongside her. She was not ashamed of this. It was a transaction, and she had entered it with her eyes open and her expectations modestly arranged. What she had not expected was to be erased on her behalf. The portrait came down at 2:30. Rowena did not watch, though she knew the moment it happened because the house shifted in the way that houses do when something is removed, a change in the quality of silence, as though the walls had drawn a breath and not released it. She was in the still room with Mrs. Ord, the housekeeper, reviewing the linen inventory. Mrs. Ord, who had served under Elspeth and had wept at her funeral and had accepted Rowena with the guarded courtesy of a woman who would not betray her former mistress by liking her replacement too quickly, said nothing about the portrait. But her pen paused over the ledger for a moment longer than the entry required, and Rowena understood that she knew. "The damask tablecloths," Mrs. Ord said, returning to the page. "There are 14. 2 want mending." "Have them mended," Rowena said. She went to the gallery after the inventory was complete. She went alone, and she went without hurrying, because she had learned in 4 months of marriage that haste was a form of confession, and she was not prepared to confess anything. The gallery was long and south-facing, its windows admitting the kind of clear May light that made the remaining portraits look both grander and lonelier than they deserved. The space where Elspeth's portrait had hung was obvious, a rectangle of wallpaper 1 shade darker than its surroundings, the ghost of a frame preserved in unfaded silk. The hook remained. No one had thought to remove it, or perhaps they had been instructed only to take the portrait and nothing more, and had obeyed with the precision that comes from not wanting to think too carefully about what one is doing. Rowena stood in front of the empty space for several minutes. She was not weeping. She was not composing a speech. She was thinking, with the quiet, methodical attention she brought to every problem, about where in this house a portrait of a dead woman and her daughter ought to hang if the living were to be honored, and the dead were not to be stored in an attic like furniture out of season. That afternoon, Nora came to the morning room as she always did after her lessons and sat in the chair nearest the window. Rowena was mending a hem, not because the household lacked a seamstress, but because the work gave her hands something to do while her mind worked elsewhere, and because her mother had taught her that a woman who could not mend her own clothes was a woman who had forgotten where she came from. "Mrs. Alderson says I may begin watercolors next month," Nora said. She did not look at Rowena when she spoke. She addressed the window or the garden beyond it, as though the information were being delivered to the air, and Rowena merely happened to be present. "That is good news," Rowena said. "Your mother painted, I think." "Mama painted flowers," Nora said. "There are 3 of her paintings in the upstairs corridor, bluebells and roses, and something Mrs. Ord says is called Love in a Mist." "Nigella," Rowena said. "It grows wild in the south garden. I have seen it." She planted it there. This was the most Nora had ever said about her mother in Rowena's presence. The child's voice was careful, controlled, a 7-year-old's imitation of composure that was so precisely done it made Rowena's chest ache, because a child should not need to practice steadiness when speaking of her own mother. "She must have had a fine eye for color," Rowena said, and kept her stitches even, and did not look up, because she had learned that Nora spoke most freely when she was not being watched. "Papa says she did." "Then Mrs. Alderson will find you a good pupil." Nora said nothing more. She sat in her chair and looked at the garden where her mother had planted nigella, and Rowena mended the hem and thought about the empty space in the gallery and the portrait wrapped in holland cloth in the attic, and a child who catalogued her mother's presence in the house the way a cartographer marks landmarks. The paintings in the corridor, the flowers in the garden, the curtains, the arrangement of chairs, as though she were afraid that if she did not keep count, the landmarks would be removed one by one until there was nothing left to prove that Elspeth Ralston had ever lived here at all. And now, of course, one of them had been. She thought of it through dinner, which she took with Dominic in the dining room as they did every evening. He spoke of his correspondence, a matter concerning his attendance at the House of Lords for the next session, a disagreement with a neighboring landowner about drainage rights, a letter from his solicitor regarding an investment in canal shares. She listened with the attentiveness that he had come to expect from her and that he mistook for contentment, because he was a man who measured the success of a marriage by the absence of complaint and had not yet learned that silence could be the most eloquent complaint of all. "Nora's governess tells me she is progressing well with her French," he said, as though the child were a crop report. "She is," Rowena said. "She read to me from a fable yesterday. Her accent is better than mine." This was the most they had spoken about Nora in a fortnight. The child was 7, dark-haired like her mother, watchful in the way that children become when they have learned that the people around them are capable of disappearing without warning. Rowena had been cautious with her, not cold, never cold, but careful not to press affection upon a child who had not invited it. They had arrived at a kind of understanding. Nora would come to the morning room after her lessons and sit in the chair nearest the window, and Rowena would read aloud from whatever she was reading, and neither of them would call it what it was. Dominic retired to his study after dinner. Rowena went to the drawing room and sat beside the fireplace, which was unlit. The evening was warm enough, and looked at the wall above the mantel. There was a landscape there presently, competent but unremarkable, purchased by some earlier duke whose taste had run to the safe and the respectable. The wall was wide. The light, even in the evening, was good. Every visitor to the house was received in this room. Every caller, every neighbor, every dinner guest sat beneath whatever hung above that fireplace. She made her decision somewhere between the second cup of tea and the moment she set her embroidery aside. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no sharp intake of breath, no moment of trembling resolve. It settled over her like a change in temperature, noticeable only in retrospect. She waited until the house was asleep. This required patience. Mrs. Ord completed her rounds at 10:30. Pethick, the steward, checked the locks and extinguished the hall candles at 11. The kitchen staff had retired by 9:30. Dominic's study fell silent at 11:15. She heard his door close, his footsteps on the stairs, the soft, conclusive sound of his bedchamber door. She waited another hour. At midnight, she took a single candle and went to the attic rooms. The stairs were narrow and uncarpeted, the wood cool beneath her stockinged feet, and the air was cold. Attics in May held the memory of winter longer than the rest of the house, as though warmth, like attention, rose only so far. The candle flame bent in the draft from the stairwell and threw long shadows across trunks and boxes and the accumulated surplus of a household that had been occupied for 6 generations. She found the portrait in the second room she tried, leaning against the wall between a rolled carpet and a writing desk, missing one leg. A cradle stood beside it, Nora's, Rowena supposed, or perhaps Dominic's own, kept for reasons no one could articulate and no one was willing to discard. The holland cloth had been draped loosely over the portrait. She removed it and looked at Elspeth's face in the candlelight, and Elspeth looked back at her with the composed half-smile of a woman who had sat for her portrait, knowing it would outlast her, but not knowing by how much. Nora, painted at perhaps 3 years old, sat on her mother's lap with one hand resting on Elspeth's arm, the gesture captured so naturally that the painter must have waited for it rather than arranged it. "I'm going to move you," Rowena said quietly. It was the only thing she said aloud the entire night. The portrait was heavy. It was not impossibly heavy. Elspeth had been painted at 3/4 length, not full, and the frame, though gilded, was not the largest in the house, but it was heavier than anything Rowena had carried before, and she was not a large woman. She managed it by tilting the frame and walking it on its corners, one side and then the other, down the attic stairs and along the first-floor corridor with the careful shuffling progress of someone moving something precious through a space not designed for it. Her arms shook. The gilded edge pressed into her palms, and she could feel the carved detail of the frame leaving marks on her skin that would still be visible the next morning, though she would wear long sleeves and no one would see them. The frame knocked against the wainscoting once, a sound that seemed in the silence as loud as a door slamming. She stopped and held her breath and listened. The house did not stir. The candle, which she had set on the console table at the top of the staircase, threw a long, thin light down the corridor that made her shadow and the portrait's shadow into one shape, a woman carrying another woman through the dark. In the drawing room, she took down the landscape, easier, lighter, smaller, and leaned it against the wall. She placed a chair before the fireplace and stood on it, and from the chair she could reach the hook that had held the landscape. The portrait's wire caught on the first attempt. She adjusted the angle, stepped down, moved the chair, and looked. Elspeth hung above the fireplace of the great drawing room, in the most prominent position in the house, where every visitor would see her. The candlelight caught the gold of the frame and the soft fall of light in the painting, and for a moment it seemed as though Elspeth were lit from within, the painted afternoon meeting the living night, and neither diminishing the other. Rowena replaced the chair. She picked up her candle. She left the room without looking back, because looking back would have meant she had done it for herself, and she had not. She did not know that Nora had watched her. The child had heard the sound of the frame against the wainscoting. Children sleep lightly in houses where people have disappeared, and had crept to the top of the stairs in her nightdress and bare feet and seen her stepmother carrying her mother's portrait down the corridor by candlelight. She had not called out. She had not followed. She had stood on the landing with her hand on the balustrade and watched until Rowena disappeared into the drawing room. And then she had gone back to bed and lain awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, thinking thoughts that a 7-year-old does not have the words for, but that settle into the body like a kind of knowledge. The Duke found the portrait at 8:20 the following morning. He had come into the drawing room for a reason he later could not recall, to retrieve a book perhaps, or to check whether the fire had been laid for the afternoon. He stopped in the doorway. The portrait was directly ahead of him, centered above the fireplace, the light from the east-facing windows falling across it with the particular clarity that early morning brings to old houses. Elspeth's face, Nora's small hand resting on her mother's arm, the afternoon light in the painting meeting the morning light in the room. He stood there for a long time. Mrs. Ord, passing through the hallway, saw him and did not interrupt. Crispin, arriving to open the shutters in the breakfast room, saw him and redirected himself without being asked. The house, which had witnessed the removal and the restoration, held its breath again and waited. What Dominic felt in that doorway was not grief, though grief was part of it. It was not guilt, though guilt was there too, folded into the recognition the way a letter is folded into an envelope, present, contained, sharp at the edges. What he felt was the sudden and disorienting understanding that someone in his house possessed a moral imagination that exceeded his own, and that this person was the woman he had married for suitability and addressed with courtesy, and kept at the precise distance that allowed him to believe he was being kind when he was in fact being negligent. He went to find her. Rowena was in the breakfast room. She was seated in her usual chair, the one nearest the window, with a plate of eggs and toast and a cup of tea that had been poured but not yet touched. She was reading the morning's correspondence, a letter from her younger sister, and she did not look up when he entered. This was not performance. She had trained herself over 4 months to expect nothing particular from his entrances, and therefore to react to none of them, and this discipline held even now when she could feel the quality of his silence from across the room and knew it was different from any silence he had brought before. He sat down across from her. He did not reach for the teapot. He did not ring for Pethick. He sat with his hands on the table, one on either side of his unused plate, and he looked at his wife with the bewildered attention of a man seeing clearly for the first time and finding the view entirely different from what he had assumed. "The portrait," he said. "Yes," she said, and turned a page of her sister's letter. "You moved it." "I did. In the night." She looked up then. Not sharply. There was nothing sharp about Rowena, nothing that cut or demanded or accused. She looked up with the same steady composure she had brought to their wedding, to their introductions, to every evening spent in polite and careful conversation across the dining table. "She ought not to have been in the attic," Rowena said. "She was the Duchess of Carver. She is the mother of your daughter. A woman does not become furniture because she has died." He opened his mouth and closed it. He was, Rowena reflected, a man who had spent 34 years being articulate and who had been rendered, for perhaps the first time in his life, without language. "I did not mean," he began. "I know," she said. And she did know. That was the precise nature of the problem. He had not meant to erase Elspeth. He had not meant to wound Nora. He had not meant to reduce his first marriage to an inconvenience to be cleared away. He had simply not thought, and thoughtlessness in a man of his position was not a minor failing. It was the one that did the most damage because it wore the face of efficiency and spoke in the language of practicality and never once recognized itself as cruelty. "I should not have ordered it removed," he said. "No. I should have spoken to you before. You should have spoken to Nora." This landed differently. She saw it in his hands, which tightened on the edge of the table and then released. Nora. The child he loved. He did love her, Rowena was certain of this, but loved in the manner of a man who believed that providing for a child and being present to a child were the same act, and who had not yet understood that a daughter who has lost her mother watches every subsequent adult with the fierce and terrified attention of someone cataloging escape routes. "You are right," he said. She picked up her teacup and drank. The tea was the temperature she preferred, not hot enough to scald, not cool enough to be unpleasant. She had learned to time it precisely. He sat with her through breakfast. He did not speak again, and she did not require him to. Pethick entered once to refill the toast rack and withdrew without a word, reading the silence with the practiced instinct of a steward who has served long enough to know when a room does not want him in it. The morning light moved across the table. Rowena finished her eggs. She opened a second letter, this one from her mother, who wrote every week with news of her sisters and the small economies of a household that was gradually, thanks to Rowena's marriage, recovering its footing. She read it with the same measured attention she gave to everything, and if the hand that held the letter trembled once, she steadied it before Dominic could see. And he did not see, because he was looking at his own hands on the table and seeing in them the hands of a man who had carried nothing heavier than correspondence, while his wife had carried a portrait down 2 flights of stairs in the dark. The silence between them was different from every silence that had preceded it. It was not comfortable. Comfort was still months away, but it was honest, and honesty, Rowena had found, was the only foundation worth building on. The portrait remained above the fireplace. Dominic did not mention having it moved again, and no one in the household suggested it. Within a fortnight, it had become so natural a part of the drawing room that visitors assumed it had always hung there, which was perhaps the highest compliment a portrait could receive, to look as though it belonged. The first visitor to remark upon it was Lady Chesham, who called on a Tuesday afternoon with her daughter and stayed for tea. She admired the portrait with the practiced appreciation of a woman who understood art well enough to be impressed and not so well as to be critical, and said, "How right it looks there. She must have been very beautiful." "She was," Rowena said. "And the child, that is Nora?" "Yes." Lady Chesham looked at the portrait and then at Rowena with the careful appraisal of a woman recalibrating someone she had previously underestimated. "Most women in your position," she said, and paused, and chose a different ending to her sentence than the one she had begun. "It is a generous placement." "It is the correct one," Rowena said, and poured more tea. What Lady Chesham said after she left the house, to her daughter, to her husband, to the 3 women she dined with that Friday, Rowena never learned precisely, though she noticed in the weeks that followed that invitations arrived more frequently, and that the quality of the regard she received when she entered a room had altered. Society, which is slow to admire but slower still to forget, had taken note. Mrs. Ord spoke of it only once. She found Rowena in the still room one morning, a week after the portrait had been moved, and stood in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her in the posture she adopted when something needed to be said that did not belong in a ledger. "Your Grace," she said, "the drawing-room fire is drawing well with the new arrangement. I wanted you to know." The fire had nothing to do with the portrait's position, and both of them knew it. Rowena looked at Mrs. Ord, at the careful, guarded, decent woman who had served Elspeth and mourned her, and who had spent 4 months deciding whether Rowena deserved anything more than correct service, and saw that the guard had come down. "Thank you, Mrs. Ord," she said. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" "No, that is all." Mrs. Ord nodded and withdrew. From that morning forward, she called Rowena Your Grace, with the warmth that had previously been reserved for Lady Elspeth, and if the household noticed the shift, and they did because servants notice everything, no one remarked upon it, because the reason was hanging above the fireplace in the drawing room and required no explanation. What changed between Dominic and Rowena did not change quickly. He was not a man given to transformation, and she was not a woman who trusted gestures over sustained attention. But he began, in the weeks that followed, to see her, not as a role filled or a position occupied, but as a person with preferences and opinions and a quality of perception that made him, if he was honest, slightly uneasy, in the way that a man becomes uneasy when he suspects that the woman across the breakfast table understands him better than he understands himself. He began asking her opinion on matters he had previously settled alone, not the drainage dispute or the canal shares, those he continued to manage with the confidence of long habit, but the household, the tenants, the education of his daughter. He discovered that Rowena had been quietly visiting the tenant families since her second week in the house, bringing food parcels and noting repairs needed, reporting none of it to him because she had not been asked and did not consider it her place to volunteer. He discovered that Mrs. Ord, who had greeted Rowena with guarded courtesy, now deferred to her on every domestic matter with the unspoken loyalty of a woman who had decided, on the evidence of one night's act, that the new Duchess deserved her allegiance. He discovered that Nora had begun sitting with Rowena every afternoon, not merely in the same room, but beside her, close enough to lean against her arm while Rowena read aloud, though neither of them acknowledged the contact. He came upon them once in the morning room, Nora's head resting against Rowena's shoulder, both of them intent on a book of botanical illustrations, and he stood in the doorway in much the same posture he had stood before the portrait, motionless, struck, aware that something was being built in his house that he had not commissioned and could not have designed, and that was more valuable than anything he had ever deliberately arranged. He spoke to Nora about her mother that evening. Not fluently. He stumbled, repeated himself, left sentences unfinished, but he spoke, and the child listened with the grave attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to be addressed. He told her that her mother had loved her. He told her that the portrait would remain above the fireplace for as long as the house stood. He told her that Rowena had put it there, and Nora, who already knew this, nodded and said, "I know, Papa. I watched her." He looked at his daughter and saw, for the first time, how much of what had happened in his house had happened without his knowledge, how much courage and decency and quiet endurance had been practiced in rooms he had not entered and hours he had not witnessed, and he felt the particular shame of a man who has been trusted to pay attention and has failed. The portrait was cleaned and reframed the following spring at Dominic's instruction. The same painting, the same position, a new frame that he chose with Nora, the two of them standing in the framer's shop in the village for the better part of an hour, debating the merits of gilt versus mahogany, while the framer waited with the patience of a man being paid by a duke. That same spring, Dominic spoke before the House of Lords for the first time on a matter of consequence, a bill concerning the provision of parish relief. And when he returned to the estate, he told Rowena about it over dinner with the halting thoroughness of a man who has discovered that he wants to be known by someone and is not entirely sure how to begin. Their son was born the following winter. They named him Geoffrey, after Rowena's father. Dominic held him in the drawing room, beneath Elspeth's portrait, and did not find this strange, because by then the portrait had become what Rowena had always intended it to be, not a monument to loss, but a record of continuity, a woman watching over the family that had grown from the one she had begun. Nora told the story when she was 17 at a dinner with her father and stepmother and two younger siblings, Geoffrey and a sister named Elspeth, because Rowena had suggested the name, and Dominic had agreed without hesitation, understanding by then that to name a living child after a dead mother was not an act of grief, but of gratitude. "I watched her carry the portrait down the stairs," Nora said. "I was 7. I stood on the landing and I saw her. She was in her nightdress and she was carrying Mama's portrait by candlelight, and she did not know I was there." Rowena set down her fork. She had not known. In 9 years, she had never known. "I decided that night," Nora said, looking at Rowena with the steady dark eyes of a woman who had once been a watchful child and who had grown into someone who knew exactly what she owed and to whom, "that when I was grown, I would be like her." Dominic reached across the table and took Rowena's hand. It was not a grand gesture. It was the gesture of a man who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, and with more patience from his wife than he deserved, that the most important things in a house are not the ones you commission, but the ones that someone places there in the night without announcement because they are right. The portrait hung above the fireplace for the rest of their lives. Visitors admired it. Children grew up beneath it. The frame was replaced once more, mahogany in the end, Nora's preference, and the painting itself was cleaned every 7 years by a man who came from London and who remarked each time that the quality of the light in the work was exceptional. Mrs. Ord retired to a cottage on the estate when her knees would no longer manage the stairs, and Rowena visited her every Thursday without fail. Crispin, who had carried the portrait to the attic on a Tuesday afternoon and found it above the fireplace on a Wednesday morning and who had never spoken of it to anyone, served the household until his own retirement and kept the secret with the uncomplicated loyalty of a man who knew which duchess had earned his respect and precisely when she had earned it. Pethick kept the accounts. The estate prospered, the drainage dispute was settled, the canal shares paid handsomely, and in the great drawing room of Carver Park, above the fireplace where every visitor could see her, Elspeth Ralston sat in her painted afternoon light with her daughter on her lap, watching over a family she had never known, placed there by a woman who had understood, before anyone else in the house, before the Duke, before the staff, before even the child who had stood on the landing, that you do not build a marriage by erasing what came before. You build it by making room. They arrive here, like a portrait hung in the right place at last whenever they are ready.